Our story continues. Someone was calling his name. He knew the voice, but could not answer it. Odyssean! He tried to wave a hand, give some sort of call, but failed. His mind sluggishly attempted to recall what had happened. Slowly, Odyssean recalled Lilia and the revelation of her nature. That horrifying memory proved enough to enable him to let out a primitive shout. A garbled sound that proved sufficient for the searcher's own calls became more pronounced. Odyssean, I know you're here somewhere. Where? It was Achilleos' voice. Odyssean finally realized. Good, faithful Achilleos. He tried to say the hunter's name, but it only came out as a rasping sound.
Here he is,
said what sounded like Cerinthia. As grateful as he was to know that she also searched for him, Odyssean suddenly grew concerned. Lilia would take special pleasure in tormenting Cyrus's daughter. Soft hands took hold of his face. Odyssean instinctively jerked away, thinking that Lilia had returned. However, that fear was quickly squashed as Cerinthia said,
Praise be, you're alive. Achilleos, Mendeln, here he is.
The sounds of figures thrashing through the brush alerted him to the others' nearby presence. He heard an oath, which had to have come from the archer. Is he wounded? Asked Mendeln, sounding more curious than concerned.
He has bruises,
Cerinthia returned.
But I see no cuts, no slashes. I don't feel any broken bones.
Another figure leaned over the fallen farmer. He looks as pale as death, Achilleos rumbled. Or worse. More and more details came back to him. He remembered fearing for his friends and his brother. He also recalled starting to walk back, but then, as if Lilia had taken even his will to live from him, Odyssean had, without warning, just blacked out. Had the others not come in search of him, he wondered whether he would have ever awakened again. He supposed he eventually would have. After all, Lilia had not seemed to want him dead, merely broken. How? He swallowed hard, then tried again. How did you know? It was as if he had asked them to join together to commit some terrible crime. All three grew oddly perturbed. Their silence added to his unease. Mendeln finally spoke. We knew that your life was in danger. Odyssean remembered his brother running through the house earlier, shouting his name. You did? We all did. The hunter and Cerinthia nodded.
I thought it was a nightmare,
she added.
But it was so terrible, I had to go check. That was when I noticed Achilleos also up.
And barely had she and I met, when Mendeln came insisting that he needed to see you a second time. The younger son of Diomedes frowned. The notion would not go away, Odyssean. I knew that you might be angry with me, but I was determined to try and warn you again, only to have all three of us discover you and Lilia gone.
Lilia,
gasped the raven-tressed woman.
We've forgotten about her. Odyssean, isn't she with you?
She was. His answer came out as a croak, not because of his condition, but rather the repulsive memories. And yet, a part of him still yearned for her. His companions anxiously looked around. He quickly shook his head. No, don't look for her. Odyssean forced himself to a sitting position. With our luck, you might find her. He sensed their confusion. With help from both Cerinthia and Achilleos, Odyssean next stood. As he did, his gaze met that of his sibling. Curiously, the nightmarish vision of his brother struck Odyssean once more. He stared with such intensity that Mendeln finally looked away, as if guilty of something. Odyssean, murmured Achilleos. What do you mean? Why wouldn't we want to find Lilia? Why wouldn't you want to find her? Had they not already been confronted with the reality of demons and spells, he could have never told them. As it was, Odyssean's shame was so great that it took him a long pause before he could finally begin. and by the time he was through, they looked as horrified as he felt. "You must have imagined it. It can't be true," the hunter insisted.
A demon?
Cerinthia blurted, with a shake of her head.
A demon?
Only Mendeln, after his initial shock, nodded in understanding. It explains so much," he finally uttered. If one looks back at all that has passed. Odyssean was not so certain that he shared his brother's opinion. He only knew that he certainly had been blind, deaf, and dumb. He had let Lilia command him around as if he were a dog. People had died because of her madness, because of her intent to create a world of magical beings. It was to their credit that they took his story to heart. Odyssean had left nothing out, not even the part where Lilia had claimed the world was called Sanctuary and had been created by rogue demons and angels. It was important to him that someone else understood the demoness had some mad plan that had stirred up the temple and the cathedral, both of which somehow had ties to her. That brought him back to her final declaration. She had left him on his own to teach him the penalty of defying her. That meant that they were all in immediate danger.
"We have to leave Partha,"
he blurted.
"We have to flee for our lives. The jungles in the lowlands are our best bet."
"Hold, Odyssean," Achilleos demanded. "What do you mean? We can't flee. To flee means to become the hunted, and there is no defense in that."
"Achilleos, all that I thought that I could do turns out to be a lie. It was all her. Everything."
The archer shook his head. "I don't know if I believe that. It doesn't ring true."
And it isn't,
insisted Cerinthia.
Odyssean, I've watched you. I've felt what you did. That could not have all been Lilia. What I sensed when you touched me was a part of you. I know that as well as I know myself.
Her face reddened as she said the last. While he appreciated all that she said, Odyssean refused to accept that his efforts had been anything but false spectacles directed in secret by Lilia.
"You didn't see how easily she manipulated me, how easily she showed me that she could make me do whatever she wanted."
Odyssean.
"No, Seri. Had she wanted to, Lilia could have just as easily slain me herself. There and then, you saw how I was when you arrived, and it takes all I can muster just to keep standing."
Achilleos grunted. There, he has a point. Let's get him to one of the horses." As his friends assisted him, Odyssean noted how he was practically a baby. So weak had his struggles with the temptress left him. Yes, Lilia had not been jesting when she had said that he was nothing without her. It would merely take the others a little longer to understand that. Unfortunately, they barely had any time left as it was. Sooner or later, someone would come for Odyssean. "Your points would have much more merit," Mendeln commented as he held the reins of the animal while Achilleos hefted Odyssean into the saddle. "If they could but explain how it is that Cerinthia and Achilleos knew that you were in danger." The trader's daughter quickly seized hold of that point.
Yes, that certainly doesn't sound like a ploy to work in her foul favor.
"You've all got to see the truth,"
he growled, tearing the reins from his brother's fingers.
"It was all a trick. This was some game between demons and others in which I played the biggest fool of all."
Bitterness overtaking him, he kicked the horse into motion and took off in the direction he had originally been heading. Achilleos gave a shout, but Odyssean paid him no heed. He had intended to flee rather than risk his friends and loved ones any longer, and that was more important than ever. But behind him, he quickly heard the sound of hoofbeats. Swearing, Odyssean urged his horse to a full gallop. The path was treacherous, and made more so because it was beginning to slope downward. But he did not care. Had the animal tripped and tossed him to his death, it would have likely been the best of ends. Not only would he no longer have to fear being twisted inside and out by manipulators, but Mendeln and the others would surely be safe. They had never been suspected of being threats or potential weapons by the temple or the cathedral. They would have nothing to fear.
Damn you, Odyssean!
Achilleos shouted.
Hold up!
The nearness of the hunter's voice startled him. He glanced back to see Achilleos barely a length behind. Much farther in the rear were the murky forms of Mendeln and Cerinthia, who had to share one mount.
Return to Partha.
Odyssean shouted back to the archer.
Take them with you. I want no more deaths, save maybe my own.
Talk sense, Odyssean. You know that none of us will leave you now, not after knowing what Lilia was and what she did. The other two were no longer in sight. Looking ahead again, Odyssean saw a fork coming up. The path to the left almost immediately narrowed dangerously. Achilleos would not be able to come alongside him. Veering, Odyssean entered. His horse nearly stumbled as the terrain grew more wild and uneven. Very few had obviously taken this route in years, but he did not care. All he wanted was for it to slow or stop those behind him. Achilleos' voice rose as the hunter swore at something. Odyssean did not look back, concentrating on his own course. The clatter of hooves behind him lessened. His friend was clearly falling behind. Then, out of the night, a series of low, thick branches cut across the trail. Odyssean barely had time to avoid striking the first one dead on. As it was, his right arm received a terrible blow and reverberated through his entire body. It was only by sheer will that the collision did not stun him enough to make him unprepared for the next and thicker branch. A third and a fourth came in rapid succession. Odyssean ducked left, then right, and then right again. The last of the branches scraped the top of his head. He felt a trickle of moisture, undoubtedly blood. But despite his injuries, Odyssean's hopes rose. Achilleos would see the branches and be forced to slow. It was a chance for the son of Diomedes to either gain on his pursuer or lose him altogether. For there were places coming into the dim moonlight that promised Odyssean such cover that even the skilled hunter would be unable to track him. Then, a crashing sound nearly caused him to steer his horse directly into a tree. Without thinking, Odyssean slowed the animal. The noise had come from back up the path, and where the treacherous branches would be. The branches. And if he had not slowed, Achilleos. Odyssean reined the horse to a halt and listened. Silence. No, the snorting of a horse. Not a horse in motion, though. He started to urge his mount forward, then hesitated again. Still no sound other than the animal. With an oath, Odyssean turned back. He had wanted to lose Achilleos, nothing more. If something worse had happened, the dark path proved just as haphazard to climb as it had to descend. Bits of earth and rock broke away under the hooves. At one juncture, the horse's shifting nearly caused Odyssean to slip. Ahead of him, a massive form loomed. Achilleos' horse, but without the hunter. Where? A groan arose from somewhere to the left, where the path dropped precariously. Odyssean's fears increased. He pulled up and, barely waiting for his mount to halt, leapt to the ground. Every muscle burned. In his anger, he had paid little mind to his own state, and now his body was angrily reminding him that he could barely walk. Yet despite that, Odyssean continued. He took both his mount's reins and those of the other horse and tied them to one of the very branches in question. Odyssean then stumbled in the direction of the moan. The irony of the situation did not escape him. Achilleos had freely come to help Odyssean, and this was how his friend had been repaid. Guilt vied with shame now. He remembered even hoping that one of the branches would cause Achilleos trouble, although not to this extent. Nevertheless, Odyssean had been aware of the danger, and yet he had not cared about anything but his own choices. The descent was a slippery one, for the ground gave way with every step. There was still not a sound of the third horse, and Odyssean wondered just how far behind his brother and Cerinthia were. He could not simply trust that if he dragged Achilleos up to the path, that they would come across him. Odyssean had ceased believing in miracles, great or small. Below him, he saw only darkness. It had been his hope that the hunter's blonde hair would stand out, but that was not the case. Odyssean grew more concerned. Was he even in the same area where his friend had ended up? Then, some urge sent him toward the left, a place he would not have considered a possible location. Yet when Odyssean thought of turning back, he found himself unable to do so. Frowning, the farmer delved deeper. A moment later, Odyssean spotted a rounded form. He dove toward it, reaching out and cautiously turning it over. As he did, a cough escaped the shape.
Odyssean? Strange. I thought I was rescuing you. I'm so sorry, Achilles. I never meant for this to happen. Can you stand?
He heard the hunter grunt in pain.
Left leg stiff, but I think it's just very sore. Give me a hand.
As Odyssean did, his own body reminded him again of what it had suffered. The two men groaned simultaneously. With a weak laugh, Achilles remarked,
We are a stalwart pair, eh?
That brought a chuckle from Odyssean.
I remember worse scrapes than this when we were children. We didn't groan at all then. Children are more resilient than old men.
They slowly wended their way back up. More than once, one or both of them slipped. As they finally neared the top, Odyssean heard the slow clatter of hooves. Mendeln and Cerinthia had finally caught up.
I promised you that we would find them,
his brother said with an unnatural calm.
You see?
But the woman did not waste time answering him, instead sliding down from the animal and racing, not toward Odyssean, but rather Achilles.
Are you all right?
She demanded, putting her arms around him.
I'm fine. I am.
Cerinthia did not seem convinced, but she finally turned to Odyssean.
What happened?
He opened his mouth to explain, but Achilles cut him off.
I was careless, Cerinthia. That was all. Fortunately, my good friend realized something had happened and came back for me.
She ran her hands over the hunter's arms, chest, and face, not relaxing in the least until she was certain that his injuries were shallow.
Praise be. If something had happened...
Odyssean saw that Achilles had spoken the truth when he had said that Cyrus's daughter had finally turned to him. It was one of the few things that made him happy this night. The two were a good match. He felt his legs starting to give. Keeping his tone level, Odyssean said,
Let's get to the horses.
It took effort for both men to move, which caused renewed concern for Achilles from Cerinthia.
Your leg, is it broken?
She gasped.
No, just bruised, like my pride. I should know to watch out for low branches.
Give me your arm,
Cerinthia insisted. She all but seized the hunter from Odyssean and guided him toward his horse. Despite all that he had been through, the scene momentarily made Odyssean smile. Other hands suddenly came to his own aid.
Let me help you,
Mendeln said, appearing next to him as if by magic.
Put your arm over my shoulder.
His brother's presence both comforted and shamed him further. Odyssean muttered,
Thank you, Mendeln.
We are all we have left. His words struck the older son of Diomedes to the core. He had concerned himself so much with Lilia that he had not truly considered Mendeln in as much depth as he should have. But with that renewed concern came again thoughts of what would happen to Mendeln and the others if they remained with him.
The Tarajan jungle,
Mendeln remarked quietly, without warning.
The deepest of them all, southwest of Kajan. What about the Tarajan jungle?
Blinking, his brother glanced at him.
Tarajan? What do you mean? You mentioned the jungle. Specified the Tarajan one. Southwest of the great city.
Did I? Mendeln pursed his lips, but did not otherwise seem startled at his lapse of memory.
It does strike me as the place to go, if we are not returning to Partha.
He nodded toward his mount.
I have some provisions and water, enough for us to get started, at least.
Admittedly, that and having 2 riders slowed us down during the chase. Uldyssian could not hide his confusion.
You gathered supplies? When?
They were already prepared. I assumed that it was an extra mount that you had abandoned at the last moment. A glance at the horse ascertained for Uldyssian that it was not the dark beast ridden by Lilia. Yet what explanation was there for a fully laden animal found waiting just when his brother needed one? Not certain whether this was a gift or a bait of a sort, Uldyssian thought again of the jungles. There was merit in the suggestion. Despite its questionable origin, somehow, coming from Mendeln, he doubted that it had been planted by the demoness.
The Tarajan jungle.
He muttered for a second time, now with more conviction. You want to go there? It was not a question. With a grim nod, Uldyssian replied,
I don't think I have any choice.
We do not have any choice. Uldyssian tightened his grip on his brother's shoulder, grateful for Mendel's determination.
We.
Do not mistake me, Uldyssian. I'm referring to Achilleos and Cerinthia too.
What about us?
Called the hunter from the saddle. Even as he asked, he pulled the trader's daughter up to him. No one questioned the change in riding partners. We plan to ride to the Tarajan jungle. Mendeln answered bluntly, before Uldyssian could properly phrase the suggestion himself.
Tarajan. The densest, most unknown I've heard. Few folks there. Taraja is the only city. The people said to oil their skins black and file their teeth like daggers.
He let out a laugh.
Sounds like a delightful place to visit.
Uldyssian thought of the journey ahead. They would first have to travel through other unexplored and possibly treacherous regions before reaching their destination. In truth, there was really only one immense jungle, but, being territorial, men always divided up places and gave them different names. The Tarajan jungle just happened to be a particular piece of the much vaster one. In fact, assuming they made it that far, it was very likely that they would not realize it for days after. He could not imagine Cerinthia in such a place.
Siri.
If you say one word about me staying behind, Uldyssian Ul Diomed, I'll teach you to regret it. There's no question as to whether I'm going.
Achilleos grinned.
And you know that I won't argue with her either.
Well aware of that, Uldyssian nodded. However, he needed them to understand the urgency of the situation.
If you come with me, there's no returning to Partha. I won't go back. There's too much of a chance that it'll be near impossible to leave again without arousing the entire town.
This brought an immediate acknowledgement from Mendeln, seeing that Achilleos and Cerinthia quickly acquiesced. I have some supplies and water, Uldyssian's brother informed them.
I'll provide fresh meat along the way.
The hunter returned without a trace of conceit. All there knew that Achilleos would be able to keep his promise with ease. There really was only one thing left to say, and Uldyssian had to say it now.
Thank you. I'd rather you all stayed back, but thank you.
As Mendeln mounted, he said, They will discover us gone, come the dawn. We should be as far away as possible by then. No one could argue with that logic. When the Parthans realized what had happened, some of them would surely go out hunting for Uldyssian, at least at first. He hated abandoning them, but it was for their own good. They would soon find out that their gifts were in truth nothing. They would feel tricked, and anger would replace adoration. As he led the party off, Uldyssian thought of how violent that anger might become. Had he left the others in Partha, they might have become the focus of the townsfolk's ire. Certainly, they would have been run out of it. In a sense, Mendeln, Achilleos, and Cerinthia were better off with Uldyssian, at least for the moment. Lucian stared into the bowl of blood, his gaze intense. He had seen everything occurring since first casting the spell, in coordination with the other 2 demons. He had found her, Lilith, in the arms of a mortal knave, and had planned well his sister's unveiling before the fool. What a delicious piece of work that had been. All her arrogance had been channeled into futile posturing and anger. She had turned on her own puppet, finally abandoning him. And there, Lilith had made the greatest of mistakes. The vision in the bowl finally began to fade, the result of the last of the life essence fading from the blood. Lucian could have redone the spell, but that would have required new bartering with Astraga and Gulag, who would have demanded much more than a simple offering he had given them the first time. That was the trouble with both demons and humans. They always wanted more. No, Lucian would handle this purely on his own, for the reward would be one too precious to share with anyone else. It would not be difficult to keep his two counterparts ignorant, for there was much he had done since assuming his role as Primus, of which they were unaware, of which even his father was unaware.
Thank you for laying the groundwork, sister dear,
Lucian rasped. He was also grateful to the late Malik and Deimos, servants who had fulfilled their duties, whether they knew it or not. It had been a shame to lose both of them, but Lucian already had a notion as to a competent replacement for the High Priest. And there were always more vicious Morlu. What was important was that by touching Malik's demon limb, which, knowing the cleric's greed and his sister's sense of irony, had been a foregone conclusion, Lilith had not only revealed herself, but had inadvertently removed, for a brief moment, any magical shields she had created. It had been at that moment that the patient Lucian had cast the spell, preparing the downfall of her plans. He had arranged it so that when certain elements went into play, Uldyssian Ul Diomed would see her for what she actually was. It had all gone so perfectly, she had even played into it further, in her fury twisting the facts so that her puppet would not realize what was the truth and what was lies, and leaving Uldyssian ready to be manipulated by him. Lucian's grin widened, then faded as the sensation that he was being watched overcame him. He immediately searched, not with his eyes, but rather with his mind, pretending to stare at the fading scene in the bowl, while in actuality scouring the chamber of the other presence. Yet despite his best efforts, he found no one but himself. Still wary, the son of Mephisto quickly searched the temple for the other two demons. He found Gulag, down below, the destructive beast tearing apart Morlu for the simple pleasure of it. Other Morlu attacked the demon with gusto, inflicting wounds that immediately resealed. This lack of success did not in the least dull their hunger. They simply attacked anew as Gulag ripped another of them apart. The demon of destruction knew that so long as he did not eat any of the broken bits, he could cause as much mayhem as he desired. The Morlu would simply be resurrected with the end of the cycle, their slaughter only making them even more vicious warriors when next they fought. Satisfied that it was not Gulag, Lucian sought then for Astraga. The spider was a more cunning creature, being of Diablo's calling. If either of the two thought to spy upon him for their own goals, it would be that one. But Astraga remained in one of the shadowed corners he preferred, dining at this moment on what little remained of Brother Icarian. Around the shrouded multi-limbed form, smaller arachnids scurried. They were of the essence of the demon, extensions of him that did his bidding while he waited. Could it have been one of them? Lucian considered, but knew that even the children, as Astraga called the creatures, bore his taint. Lucian would have recognized him in them. Still motionless, he surveyed the hidden chamber once more, but again found nothing. Demons, being what they were prone to unnatural distrust, and Lucian knew that even he was not immune from that. He finally pushed the incident from his mind. All that mattered was Lilith's puppet. She had sent him on the path. Lucian would now complete his education, or, if the human proved to be nothing of value after all, destroy him. In a place that was and was not real, a figure shrouded in black materialized. Around him, There was nothing but absolute darkness, yet he showed no discomfort in being there. In fact, this was home for him, as much as anywhere had been in 1,000 lifetimes. He waited in silence, aware that the one with whom he needed to speak would come when it was right to do so. The shrouded figure understood that it might mean waiting for what seemed days, weeks, or even years, but that did not matter. In the other place, that which was called Sanctuary, no time would pass at all. He would return at the very moment that he had left, which still might be too late. There was no sound, no wind. He felt solid ground beneath his booted feet, but knew that to be an illusion. In this place, everything that existed was but the dreams of his teacher. Then, from above there came illumination, a warm light that stirred his tired bones. He gazed up, his eyes immediately adjusting to the difference. Above him, what appeared to be an array of distant stars formed. At first, they clustered together, but quickly began to spread far apart. As they did, they formed a vague shape, like a constellation. The stars create a half-seen, gargantuan image that, to his trained eye, resembled a beast as mythic as himself.
It is her brother that moves,
the shrouded figure murmured.
He does not. That can only mean one thing.
And in a voice that would have made even the angels pause, the other replied,
Yes. There will